this is an iHeart podcast.
Nationwide is so much more than a great insurance company. They're one of America's largest financial services companies. Like how I'm more than just Peyton Manning. I'm also motivating Manning. When I say insurance, you say financial services. Insurance.
Financial services.
Insurance.
Financial services.
Now when I say nationwide, you say is both. Nationwide.
Is both.
Nationwide.
Is both.
For your insurance and financial needs, Nationwide is on your side.
Nationwide Investment Services Corporation, member FINRA, Columbus, Ohio.
This message is brought to you by Apple Card. Apple Card members can earn unlimited daily cash back on everyday purchases wherever they shop. This means you could be earning daily cash on just about anything, like a slice of pizza from your local pizza place or a latte from the corner coffee shop. Apply for Apple Card in the Wallet app to see your credit limit offer in minutes. Subject to credit approval. Apple Card issued by Goldman Sachs Bank USA, Salt Lake City branch. Terms and more at applecard.com.
This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, and in this episode 1057 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, thanks for tuning in. As the saying goes, all good things must come to an end, and my hot streak with this Sleepers episode mostly ended in week 11. Mostly. It actually wasn't like a horrific week, but there were some spots that were pretty bad. Like at quarterback. It was easily the worst quarterback week of the season. Joe Flacco, JJ McCarthy, Aaron Rodgers, and Tua Tagovailoa were all pretty bad. I did talk about Jacoby Brissett. That was good. And Marcus Mariota was at least usable. But it was a rough week at quarterback. Running back was actually okay. I'd actually call it pretty good. The biggest miss was Woody Marks, who couldn't take advantage of a good matchup and a good workload. But I did talk about Bam Knight, Sean Tucker went off, Chris Rodriguez was fine, Emmanuel Wilson, he got more work too. That was pretty lucky though. And then Jaleel McLaughlin found the end zone. Also kind of lucky. And then at wide receiver, it was just fine this past week. Wan'Dale Robinson and Quentin Johnston were really bad calls in that top tier. Tez Johnson didn't do a thing. But I did call out Trey Tucker, Christian Watson, Jaden Higgins almost scored double-digit PPR points, Mac Hollins was at 10.4, and then Greg Dortch and Michael Wilson absolutely crushed it. Tight end, very rough. None of the tight end streamers scored more than Zach Ertz's 8.2 PPR points, and Ertz was a top-tier player. He wasn't even much of a streamer. And then the defensive streamers, they weren't very good either. So basically, the streaming positions, they were terrible last week. But at least running back and wide receiver was decent. Overall, it was like a 3 to 4 out of 10 kind of week. Before, I'd been hitting like 8s and 9s consistently. I'm hoping I can bounce back here in week 12. We'll start with the tier of players who are rostered in 50 to 80% of Yahoo leagues, and we'll kick things off with a couple of quarterbacks. One of them is Brock Purdy. The 49ers have an implied team total over 27 points this week, and they get more of a neutral to slightly below average matchup against the Panthers. I think there's some concern here for maybe a lack of passing volume for the 49ers, but the San Francisco defense is not playing well at all right now. They rank bottom 10 in the league in yards per game allowed and EPA per play allowed. So it may keep the volume up for the offense. Regardless though, as we saw in week 11, Purdy can get it done with the weapons that he's got. Sam Darnold is kind of in a similar spot. They get Tennessee, they're big favorites, so you've got to worry a little bit about the passing volume. And we've seen Darnold hit just 12 pass attempts a couple of weeks ago against Arizona. But Seattle has a 27-point implied team total. If they do score 3 or 4 offensive touchdowns, a couple of those should, from a projection standpoint, come through the air. And that means Sam Darnold could be startable this week. Now moving on to running back, Woody Marks was in a good spot last week, yes. But he's in a great spot this week. Buffalo has been awful against running backs this year, ranking as the 3rd best opponent for running backs by adjusted points allowed. We saw what Sean Tucker did to them last week. Marks has now seen a 74% and 86% running back rush share over his last 2 games. And even if this game script goes south for Houston, which is possible, Marks is the one who would likely find the field in that negative game script. So I think he makes a lot of sense this week. If Ramondre Stevenson is back, I don't think he's that bad of a play. Like I said on yesterday's 10 Trends episode, I do think TreVeyon Henderson has earned his spot as the 1A in that backfield. But we also have no idea at this point. Stevenson's probably going to get some goal line looks too. And they get the best matchup on paper, Cincinnati. The Bengals not only have allowed the most adjusted fantasy points to running backs, but teams against Cincinnati have seen their running backs rush for 42 yards above their season-long averages. That's also worse than the league. As long as Josh Jacobs is out this week, Emmanuel Wilson, he's a reasonable RB2 play. He saw every running back rush after Jacobs' injury last week, and he had a 60% route share. The matchup against Minnesota, it's not ideal. They rank as a bottom 10 opponent for running backs by adjusted points allowed. But volume should be there for Emmanuel Wilson, as long as Josh Jacobs is sidelined. If Isaiah Pacheco is out again, then Kareem Hunt is definitely someone to look at. The Chiefs have a 26.5 point implied team total. They get an average, maybe slightly below average matchup this week against the Colts. But Hunt's coming off a game where he saw every single running back rush for Kansas City. He had a season-high 61% route share. For as much as I want Brashard Smith to be more involved, and I think he should be, we can't deny that usage. I definitely didn't expect the Giants to keep it as close as they did last week with the Packers, but it's going to be harder for them this week as they go to Detroit. That means Wan'Dale Robinson is definitely in play. He's had a 31% target share or better in 3 straight games and in 4 of his last 5. He's averaging almost 10 targets per game over his last 5 games. Now, Detroit's not necessarily an amazing matchup for a slot receiver. It's more neutral to above average, but you can't ignore that type of volume. Now, this next one's a little bit more out there. I'm going to say Rashid Shaheed, mostly because I think there's a chance for a big play. We may not see that much volume through the air for Seattle this week, like I just talked about with Sam Darnold, but Tennessee is bad against perimeter wide receivers. And Shaheed, he saw a 25% slot rate last week. He mostly played on the outside, and we know that he's a big play threat. And the Titans, they've allowed the highest completion percentage on deep ball throws this year. I think there's a risk for very, very few points for Rashid Shaheed. There's no doubt about it. But there's also some big play potential. Michael Wilson's a very obvious choice in this tier this week. The Cardinals threw the ball a lot last week, yes, but he still had a 32% target share. And now, Arizona gets a Jacksonville team that's been much worse against perimeter wide receivers than slot ones. They've actually allowed bottom 5 numbers to slot wide receivers this year, including the fewest adjusted points. That's why I'm not quite as high on Greg Dortch this week. But Wilson, he only ran 15% of his routes out of the slot last week. With Marvin Harrison Jr. out once again, Wilson's a very solid play. Alec Pierce doesn't have the best matchup against Kansas City this week, but his usage is kind of undeniable at this point. He's got a 26% target share per game rate over his last 4 games. That's led to almost 15 PPR points per game. And for what it's worth, Kansas City may not allow a ton of deep balls to be thrown on them, but they've given up the 7th highest 20-plus air yard completion rate in football this year. That could help Pierce make a big play. I think you can go to Theo Johnson if you're hurting at tight end this week. Now, there's a chance we get a lot of passing volume from the Giants, no matter who's under center for them. In Detroit, they're just a below-average matchup for tight ends. Now, Johnson had his lowest target share in weeks last week with Jameis Winston, which does make me a little concerned if Winston does play. Right now, I have no idea. But the volume in this game could make Theo Johnson a reasonable streamer. And look, last week, he still had a really solid 84% route share. This next group of players consists of guys rostered in 20 to 50% of Yahoo leagues, so we're digging just a little bit deeper. Jacoby Brissett in this tier, he's a really good choice at quarterback in my opinion. Since becoming the starter for Arizona, he's finished as the QB 7, 12, 10, 9, and 4 in weekly scoring. He's averaging 21 standard fantasy points per game, and he hasn't fallen below 19.4. Now he gets a Jacksonville team that's given up the 7th most adjusted points to quarterbacks this year. Now, he may not have Marvin Harrison Jr., but Jacksonville's been a great matchup for tight ends as well. They've allowed the 2nd most adjusted fantasy points to that position and the 8th highest adjusted target share. This Cardinals offense, they target the tight end position at a higher rate than any other team. This offense runs through Trey McBride. That should help Jacoby Brissett in this matchup. Now, at the time of this recording, I don't know if Jaylen Warren's going to go this week. If he doesn't go, then Kenneth Gainwell, he's a very obvious play. But Gainwell could get some run regardless. In Chicago, they're the 7th best matchup for running backs by adjusted points allowed. And they're giving up the 12th highest adjusted target share per game too. So it's a good spot for Steelers running backs in general. I won't lie, I'm a huge Sean Tucker stan, like dating back to when he came out of college. Seeing him do what he did last week, it was awesome because I'm a big believer in his talent. And while I do think we could see him go to like a 60, 65% running back rush share this week, maybe even higher, and while I do think he's a reasonable sleeper to call out this week, which is why I'm calling him out, I do want to at least be reasonable about this. Now, this obviously all assumes that Bucky Irving is sidelined. But the Buccaneers, they go from facing the Bills, an awesome matchup, to facing the Rams, which has become the worst matchup on paper by adjusted points allowed to running backs. And Tucker, he hasn't been that much of a receiving factor. I know he scored through the air last week, but he's only had a 22% route share the last couple of weeks. So you can play him because it's hard to find waiver wire running backs right now. Just volume on the waiver wire in general. But I wouldn't set your expectations amazingly high like last week. Bashaw Tutin suffered an ankle injury against the Chargers last week, which is unfortunate because he was seeing more work than Travis Etienne for most of that game. If he's able to go this week, I don't mind him against Arizona. The Cardinals are a totally average opponent against running backs by adjusted points allowed, and Tutin was pacing to have over half of Jacksonville's running back rushes in that game last week, and he has the upside of seeing goal line work. So keep him on your radar if he goes, just like I talked about on the 15 transaction show. Tajay Spears is sort of a staple in this tier for me, mostly because he's going to get you something each week. That's due to the fact that Spears has a 12% target share per game rate over his last 5. They get the Seahawks this week, and they're big underdogs. Spears is coming off a game where he ran a route on over half of the team's dropbacks. So if they trail, that should benefit Spears. He's played more long down and distance and 2-minute snaps than Tony Pollard since returning from injury this year. Seattle's also 10th in adjusted target share allowed to running backs. There's no Amari DiMercado this week, but Trey Benson's practice window did open. So maybe he goes. But if not, Bam Knight, definitely someone who could get a decent amount of work. It's not the easiest matchup against Jacksonville, but the Arizona running back, the top running back on that team, has averaged almost 13 PPR points per game over their last 6 games. On the projections front, Knight would get more of the early down work, but then Michael Carter, he'd be a deep sleeper. So I'll just call him out here. Carter ran around on 49% of the team's dropbacks last week and saw a 12.5% target share. So we might get some PPR love with Michael Carter, as long as Trey Benson is out. Moving on to wide receiver, it's ugly, it's gross, but Darnell Mooney, he's got to get a shout with Drake London sidelined this week. Mooney's been seeing route shares well north of 90% over his last 4 games, and he's had target shares of 32% and 24% over his last 2. The production just hasn't been there, but the usage, it has been. Now he gets a Saints team that's been pretty good at limiting wide receivers in fantasy, but they've been really above average at stopping slot players and below average at stopping perimeter ones. Mooney will go inside and out, but he'll likely spend more time on the outside, especially with Drake London out. He's done that every game this year, so you could do worse. I like Christian Watson again this week. He saw 20% of Green Bay's targets in Week 11. He's seen his target share rise each week since coming back from injury in Week 8. His route participation rate has been over 80% now in back-to-back games. The Packers, they're at home against admittedly a tough Minnesota defense for fantasy purposes, but they've actually given up the second highest completion rate in football on deep passes this year. Only Tennessee has been worse, and we know that Christian Watson can get down the field. Mac Hollins has been getting it done the last handful of weeks, largely without Kayshon Boutte. Hollins has seen 11.5 PPR points per game over his last 4, including a target share per game rate of about 22%. Kayshon Boutte, though, would be my preferred option if he plays this week, which honestly, it's trending in that direction. The Patriots get the Bengals, and not only do they have a 28.5 point implied team total, but Cincinnati has given up top half numbers to wide receivers this year by adjusted points allowed. The Bengals are also allowing 50 passing yards per game above expected to opposing quarterbacks. And for the record, I wish I could call out Hunter Henry on this show, but he's now rostered in over 80% of Yahoo leagues. I guess I'll go to Tez Johnson in this tier again too. The Rams are the 12th best matchup for wide receivers by adjusted points allowed, and teams facing LA, they generally run 3 to 4 more plays per game than their season-long average. They also tend to see their pass rate increase by about 4 percentage points when they face the Rams. One thing that does scare me is this pressure rate matchup. It's the toughest one of the week, according to the numbers. The Rams generate a ton of pressure, and the Buccaneers, they have not been great at stopping that, at preventing that pressure. And Johnson, he's often used down the field. So Baker Mayfield may not have time for those plays to develop. With that being said, Tampa Bay may not have an easy time running the ball in this game. That could lead to a lot more volume through the air. We've seen that in the past with teams against the Rams. So I don't think Tez Johnson is a horrible play, despite only seeing 11% target shares in back-to-back games. I've got no tight ends for you in this tier, so let's just move on to the next one. The final group of players consists of guys rostered in fewer than 20% of Yahoo leagues, and to me, this is the most enjoyable group to research each week. We'll start at quarterback. We'll go with Bryce Young. As I talked about in the 10 Trends episode yesterday, the Panthers had their best pass rate over expected of the season in week 11. Now, I don't know if that's going to really continue into week 12 and beyond. What I do know is that the 49ers are a good matchup for Bryce Young. They rank as the 11th best matchup by adjusted fantasy points allowed to quarterbacks, and they've given up 17 passing yards per game to quarterbacks over expected. The 49ers have suffered all sorts of injuries this year, both on the defensive and offensive side of the ball. And that's caused them to give up a lot of fantasy points to quarterbacks over the last handful of weeks. In fact, since week 5, quarterbacks are averaging 22.2 standard fantasy points per game against the 49ers. So maybe Bryce Young follows up his strong performance from last week with another good one. At running back, I'm going to go to Blake Corum. He's now seen a running back rush share per game rate of 43% over his last 4. He's averaged 11.5 rush attempts per game during that time. We want more positive game scripts for the Rams in order for Corum to be utilized well. And LA is a 6.5-point home favorite this week against a Bucs team that ranks as the 6th best opponent for running backs by adjusted fantasy points allowed. So Corum works. Now also in this tier, Michael Carter, but I talked about him earlier. We can move past him. Let's shift to Keaton Mitchell. Baltimore is a 13.5-point home favorite against the Jets this week, giving them a 29-point implied team total, the second highest on the slate. If they get ahead in this game, there's a chance that we see more Keaton Mitchell. He's seen at least 4 rush attempts in each of his last 4, but Baltimore hasn't played in a game script like they might see in this one. So there's room for more volume for Mitchell. And we know that he's capable of generating some big plays. At wide receiver, with Jamar Chase suspended this week, I'd expect Andre Yosivach to get a lot more run for this Bengals team, at least from a volume standpoint. He's already run a lot of routes. He's seen multiple games this year with a 90% route share. But there's going to be more target share opportunity because Jamar Chase is sidelined. And we can pencil in Jamar Chase with like a 30% target share. The Bengals get a New England team that's given up the 4th most adjusted fantasy points to wide receivers this year. So Yosivach, not a bad play at all. The best slot matchup in football is arguably the one against San Francisco. They've given up the most fantasy points to slot wide receivers this year. They have the 2nd highest adjusted slot target share allowed. It's a great matchup. The player in Carolina who could take advantage of that matchup this week is Jalen Coker. He's seen route shares above 75% in each of his last 4 games. His slot rate often hovers the 60% mark. Like I said with Bryce Young, it's a good spot for this Panthers passing attack. And maybe Jalen Coker can take advantage. Luther Burden has the best per route numbers of any qualified player on the Bears. And he's starting to see more work. He had a route share of 61% this past week. That led to a season-high 18% target share. Now he gets a Steelers secondary that ranks as the 2nd best matchup for wide receivers this year by adjusted fantasy points allowed. Pittsburgh's given up 51 passing yards over expected per game this year. So Luther Burden's in a pretty nice spot. And then if you want an even deeper play, the last time we saw the Saints, Devon Vele had a 100% route share. He hadn't been above the 50% mark all year, but in week 10, he was at 100%. The Saints also just released Brandon Cooks on Wednesday, so Vele, he looks like the number 2 guy in that offense right now. Atlanta's not the best matchup in the world, but they're now middle of the road in adjusted fantasy points allowed to wide receivers. With his route share, you might find some usability with Vele. AJ Barner had awesome peripherals last week. 26% target share, 11 targets, and a season-high 80% route share. The Seahawks also threw it more than they typically throw it. But tight end's really tough this week. And those peripherals, if they were to continue, they can work in most matchups. That's really what this is about. I don't think Barner is someone that's going to do what he did last week again this week. But he could be used as a bye-week fill-in if need be. After all, Seattle's projected to score a lot of points. At defense this week, I really do like Vegas. Shedeur Sanders is going to start for Cleveland, and in his outing last week, he posted the second lowest completion rate over expected of any quarterback this year. It's a low total game, and Vegas is playing at home. But there's also Jacksonville against Arizona. I don't mind the Jags in that spot. And there's Chicago against Pittsburgh. And I even think that you could use New Orleans this week against Kirk Cousins and the Falcons. So those are my 4 streaming defenses for you this week. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you yet subscribed to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter and on Blue Sky at Late Round QB. Thanks for listening, everyone. I'll catch you tomorrow with the weekly mailbag show.
Running a business is hard enough. Don't make it harder with a dozen apps that don't talk to each other. One for sales, another for inventory, a separate one for accounting. That's software overload. Odoo is the all-in-one platform that replaces them all. CRM, accounting, inventory, e-commerce, HR. Fully integrated, easy to use, and built to grow with your business. Thousands have already made the switch. Why not you? Try Odoo for free at odoo.com. That's odoo.com.
At Hill's Pet Nutrition, we know that pet parent guilt is real. Leaving too long, playing too little. New homes, new babies, waking them up when they look so comfy. Running out of patience, running out of treats, running the vacuum. You can only do so much. That's why there's Hill's, science-led nutrition to help you give more love than humanly possible. Because you're only human, there's Hill's. Find the right food at hillspet.com/science does more.
This is an iHeart podcast.